An atheist journalist thought they had the perfect argument until Islamic scholar Yasir Qadhi responded with a story that changed everything. The stage was set. The bright studio lights illuminated the modern set of The Rational Discourse, a renowned talk show known for its deep intellectual and philosophical debates. At the center of it all was Dr. Yasir Qadhi, the well-respected Islamic scholar, with his composed demeanor and thoughtful gaze. Opposing him was Alan Brooks, a veteran journalist with a reputation for being direct, unfiltered, and relentless in his questioning. Millions watched, not just in the studio, but across the world. Although the debate had been framed as a discussion on faith and reason in the modern world, everyone knew it was bound to go much deeper. Dr. Qadhi had built a reputation for engaging with difficult theological questions head-on, never shying away from intellectual challenges. Alan, on the other hand, was famous for putting his guests on the spot, exposing what he believed were contradictions in their arguments. For the first 20 minutes, the discussion remained a philosophical back and forth. The role of religion in ethics, historical contributions of faith, and the interplay between science and belief. Dr. Qadhi handled the rapid-fire questions with precision and clarity. He wasn't just a scholar, he was an engaging thinker, someone who understood how to connect with both skeptics and believers alike. Then Alan leaned slightly in his chair, narrowing his eyes. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but anyone trained in public speaking would have noticed. He was about to shift the conversation from abstract intellectual discourse to something deeply personal. The atmosphere in the room changed. The producers, the cameramen, even the live audience seemed to sense that the debate was about to take an unexpected turn. Alan spoke in a measured tone. Dr. Qadhi, you often emphasize faith as a fundamental aspect of human existence. You've even argued that faith plays a role in shaping morality and meaning. But let's be honest, religion, especially Islam and Christianity, is in decline. More and more people are moving away from faith. Science has given us explanations that religion never could. And yet, you continue to defend faith as if it is an undeniable truth. Witama. A murmur ran through the audience. Dr. Qadhi didn't respond immediately. He let the question settle, allowing its weight to be fully felt. Alan wasn't just questioning his personal beliefs. He was challenging the very relevance of faith in the modern world. The journalist continued, his voice steady but pressing. Dr. Qadhi, I ask you this. Why do millions of people consider faith nothing more than an old-fashioned crutch? Something that holds back progress rather than propelling it forward? Do you truly believe that is an unfair assessment? Or do you simply refuse to accept that faith is gradually losing its place in contemporary society? A shift in the room was almost tangible. Some members of the audience adjusted in their seats, as if bracing for the scholar's response. The camera zoomed in, capturing every subtle movement, every expression. Alan Brooks had thrown a spark into dry grass, and everyone was waiting to see whether Dr. Qadhi would let it ignite or extinguish it with something entirely unexpected. But Dr. Qadhi was in no rush to respond. He took a slow, thoughtful breath. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unwavering, and then offered a small, knowing smile. He had heard this question before, countless times, in different forms, from different voices, and he knew exactly what to say. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen rhythmically against the table, waiting. The audience waited. The silence in the studio was not uncomfortable. It was charged with anticipation. Finally, Dr. Qadhi spoke, his voice calm yet firm. You say that faith is a crutch that impedes progress. But let me ask you something, Alan. He paused briefly, allowing the weight of his words to settle before tilting his head slightly. When science fails to provide an answer, what do people turn to? Alan pressed his lips together but did not interrupt. He had expected a defensive response, but this was different. Dr. Qadhi continued, his voice steady and deliberate. It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable. It's easy to ridicule belief when your job is secure, your family is healthy, and the world makes sense. He paused for a moment, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Alan. But when the ground beneath your feet collapses, when your child is lying in a hospital bed and the doctors tell you there is nothing more they can do, when you stand before a freshly dug grave, realizing that no amount of logic or reason can bring back the person you love, what then? A profound silence engulfed the studio. Even the producers, who typically whispered behind the cameras, seemed frozen in place. Alan straightened his posture and adjusted his tie, never breaking eye contact. People turn to faith because they are desperate, he said, his tone neutral but pointed. That doesn't make it real. It just makes it comforting. Dr. Qadhi nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated that very response. Consolation is not a weakness, Alan. It is part of what makes us human. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable intensity. And faith, true faith, is more than mere comfort. It is resilience. It is hope. It is the belief that even in the darkest moments, there is still meaning. That suffering is not pointless. That loss is not the end. The weight of his words settled over the room, and for the first time, Alan Brooks did not have an immediate rebuttal. There is still a purpose. Dr. Qadhi leaned slightly forward, his eyes steady. You can call it naive if you want, Alan, but let me tell you something. Faith is the only thing that has kept human beings from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years. Alan exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly in his seat. So according to you, faith is necessary for survival? Dr. Qadhi shook his head. No, Alan. Faith is what makes survival make sense. A flicker of a smile crossed Alan's lips, though it was unclear whether it was out of amusement or skepticism. All right, Dr. Qadhi, let's talk facts. He made a small gesture with his hand as if resetting the conversation. Religious institutions have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history. Wars, oppression, corruption, and yet you continue to defend faith as though it has only been a force for good. How do you reconcile that? Dr. Qadhi remained unfazed. I will not deny that throughout history, atrocities have been committed in the name of religion. His tone remained calm, steady. But let's be fair, Alan. Faith has also been the driving force behind some of humanity's greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness. He paused for a moment, letting the thoughts settle before continuing. The abolition of slavery, civil rights movements, the establishment of hospitals, schools, and countless charities all were initiated by people who believed that their faith compelled them to serve others. You can't erase those contributions simply because some have twisted faith to serve their own agenda. Alan remained silent, his eyes studying Dr. Qadhi carefully. He seemed to be weighing his next words, but for the first time in the conversation, he didn't have an immediate rebuttal. Dr. Qadhi took the opportunity. But if you really want to understand why I believe in faith, why I defend it, his voice softened just a little, lowering not out of hesitation, but as if inviting Alan into a more personal space. It's not because of history. It's not because of politics. He paused briefly, then added, it's because of a person I met many years ago. Alan's brow furrowed slightly. One person? Dr. Qadhi nodded, his gaze unwavering. Many years ago, when I was just starting my studies, I had the opportunity to meet an elderly woman named Amina at a local masjid. It was an outreach program for the elderly, one of those initiatives where people often come for a few photos, shake some hands, and leave. He took a slow breath, his voice lowering slightly. I wasn't there for anything special. I was supposed to observe, take notes, perhaps offer a polite smile and move on. But Amina, she stopped me in my tracks. Alan's neutral expression remained, but he was no longer looking at his notes. He was listening. Amina had a quiet presence, not because she was strong in the way the world usually defines strength. On the contrary, she was fragile, her hands worn from years of labor. She spoke softly, but when she did, people listened. There was something about her, a silent strength. The kind of strength you only acquire when you've survived things that should have broken you. She told me she had buried 2 sons. Dr. Qadhi's voice remained firm, steady. One died of cancer. The other was taken by a reckless driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. She had no siblings, no immediate family. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle into the room. The silence was heavy, yet no one dared to break it. And yet, Dr. Qadhi continued, she was there in front of me, smiling, sipping her tea, and asking about my life, as if the world had not tried to take everything from her. Alan's eyes flickered with something, curiosity, perhaps even the beginnings of understanding. Dr. Qadhi's voice tensed slightly. I barely remember how I asked her the question, but I did. How do you endure so much loss? How do you carry on with that warmth, with that kindness, as if life had not shattered you? He turned his gaze toward Alan, not as an opponent in a debate, but simply as another human being, one seeking to understand. She answered me with something I will never forget. Dr. Qadhi swallowed, then continued. She told me, faith is not about evidence. It is about what keeps you going when there is no evidence. The silence in the studio was absolute. Even the faint hum of the cameras seemed to have faded into the background. She told me that every morning she woke up and thanked Allah, not because life had been easy, not because she had been spared from suffering, but simply because she was still here. Dr. Qadhi exhaled slowly, his voice softening but never losing its weight. She was in her late 70s when I met her, and I thought I understood what strength was. But Amina showed me what it truly means. He leaned forward slightly. Faith is not something people cling to out of desperation, Alan. Faith is what keeps them from falling apart. The words hung in the air, filling the space between them. Alan blinked. He opened his mouth slightly, as if he was about to say something, then closed it. For the first time in the debate, he had no immediate response. The weight of Dr. Qadhi's story could be felt throughout the studio. Even the host, usually eager to keep the conversation moving, remained silent. Dr. Qadhi didn't try to fill the void. He let it be. Finally, Alan cleared his throat and shifted slightly in his seat. That's a powerful story, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. But then, after a pause, he added, but that's just it, Dr. Qadhi. It's a story. Amina found something that worked for her. That doesn't mean faith is a universal truth. Dr. Qadhi nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated that answer. You're right about that, Alan, he said. Faith isn't about proving. Faith isn't about proving something to others, Alan. Dr. Qadhi's voice was steady, his eyes unwavering. It's about what people have lived through. He paused briefly, allowing the words to settle before continuing. And if you really listen, if you truly pay attention, you'll hear that story told a million times, in different ways by different people, across generations, across civilizations. Alan exhaled heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at Dr. Qadhi with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Look, Dr. Qadhi, that's my problem with faith. His tone was more measured now, less combative. It can't be measured. It's based on emotions, on personal experiences. It can't be quantified. And yet, people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone. Dr. Qadhi tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. You mean something like hope? Alan blinked. Hope? Yes, Dr. Qadhi leaned forward slightly. Hope also can't be measured. You can't prove its existence in a tangible way. He let those words sink in before continuing. And yet, people have fought wars for it. They've survived the impossible for it. They cling to it, even when logic tells them they shouldn't. Alan shifted in his seat, but didn't interrupt. Dr. Qadhi studied him carefully before asking, Tell me, Alan, if a person loses their home in an earthquake, would you tell them that their hope is nothing more than simple emotional solace? That their belief that something better will come isn't real, just because you can't put it under a microscope? Alan didn't respond, his lips pressed together as he processed the question. Dr. Qadhi kept his gaze firm. That's the point with faith. His voice was calm, yet carried an undeniable conviction. Faith is not about controlling people. It's not about imposing a belief on anyone. He let the words settle, then continued. Faith is about how people make sense of the most difficult moments in life. Alan remained silent. Dr. Qadhi leaned back slightly. You can call it irrational, Alan, but when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, when they find the strength to keep going, even when there is none, there's something about that, something you can't measure, but you also can't ignore. The studio remained eerily quiet. Alan, usually so quick to counter, tapped his fingers against the table softly. His once sharp, defiant posture seemed to have softened. He was no longer debating, he was thinking. Sensing the shift, the host of the program finally spoke. Alan, do you have a response to that? Alan opened his mouth slightly, as if about to speak, but then closed it. He glanced toward the audience, as if searching for some anchor, some external validation, but no one spoke. No one moved. Finally, he sighed. His voice when he spoke was different. I think I need to process it. A murmur ran through the audience. It wasn't the fierce counterattack they had expected. It wasn't a triumphant rebuttal. It wasn't a victory. It was something far rarer, an honest moment of reflection. But what had just happened was something much rarer, a moment of honesty, yet the true reaction, the one that would resonate far beyond the walls of the studio, was still to come. The debate ended a few minutes later, but the conversation was far from over. The final applause was hesitant, scattered, as if the audience was still processing what they had just witnessed. No one stood up immediately. This had not been a typical intellectual exchange, a mere debate to be dissected and dismissed. Something had been felt, and that was not easy to ignore. Alan looked at Dr. Qadhi, held his gaze for a moment, then gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible, before removing his microphone. He did not stay for post-show analysis. He did not linger for casual conversation. He walked straight out of the studio, shoulders stiff, lost in thought. Qadhi, on the other hand, remained in his seat for a few moments longer. He could hear the soft murmurs of the production crew. The audience exchanged glances. Some moved, some visibly unsettled, but no one was indifferent. Then, the cameras turned off and the first wave arrived. His phone vibrated incessantly. Missed calls, messages, notifications piling up. Social media had exploded. Clips of the exchange were spreading at an astonishing speed. Every word was analyzed, every pause scrutinized. But what surprised Dr. Qadhi the most was not the reaction of his usual audience. It was the response of those who had never supported him before. I am not religious, but what he said made me think. There has never been someone who defended faith without attacking those who don't believe. That was different. This was not about religious dogma. This was about something bigger. Comment after comment, post after post. People weren't just reacting. They were listening. His team was already at work, coordinating responses to the media. The headlines followed quickly. Yasir Qadhi leaves atheist journalists speechless. An unexpected debate that is shaking the intellectual world. Qadhi just changed the conversation on faith and reason. Even late-night talk shows, places that typically dismissed or ridiculed religious scholars, were discussing the debate with unexpected seriousness. Yet, the most surprising thing of all, Alan said nothing. The entire night, the journalist, who was always the first to seize the narrative, remained completely silent. No tweets, no interviews, no follow-up comments, nothing, until the next morning. At exactly 8:37 a.m. the next morning, at exactly 8:37 a.m., Alan Brooks finally broke his silence with a single message. I've been in journalism for over 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview realizing I had more questions than answers. That was it. No grand statements, no attempts at damage control, just honesty. And that was enough to unleash a new wave of reactions. But the true impact of what had happened would not become clear until days later. What had started as a standard discussion on faith and reason had morphed into something far deeper. It was no longer just about Dr. Qadhi or Alan Brooks. It was about something that people had avoided admitting for years. People were searching for something more. Social media was saturated with the topic. It was impossible to scroll through the internet without seeing clips of the exchange dissected from every angle. Podcasters, columnists, and commentators weighed in. Some called it a defining moment for faith in public discourse. Others saw it as a wake-up call. But the most surprising reactions came from the most unexpected places. A comedian known for ridiculing religion admitted on his podcast, "Look, I still don't believe in God, but that man made me want to." And that says a lot. A renowned scientist tweeted, "Faith and science don't have to be enemies." Last night, I was reminded why so many people still cling to belief, even in the face of uncertainty. But then came the emails. Dr. Qadhi's inbox had always been full. Messages from students, scholars, critics, and those seeking guidance. But now messages were arriving from people who didn't fit into any of those categories. One in particular caught his attention. It was from a woman named Rebecca. "I haven't stepped a foot in a mosque in 20 years. I lost my faith a long time ago. But after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried. Not because I suddenly found God or had some dramatic revelation, but because I realized something. I missed believing in something bigger than myself. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think." Dr. Qadhi read the message once, then twice, then a third time. For years, he had engaged in interfaith discussions, theological debates, and academic discourse. But this was different. This wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about intellectual victories. It was about a conversation that people were afraid to start. And it wasn't just Rebecca. In the weeks that followed, more stories poured in. People sharing their own moments of faith, their grandmothers, their mentors, their neighbors. The stranger in a hospital waiting room who had whispered words of faith to them when they needed it most. This wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. This wasn't about conversions or ideological battles. This was about remembering something that modern discourse often dismisses. That faith, whether in Guasal, in humanity, or in something yet beyond our understanding, is not a weakness. It is what has kept people going when all else has failed. And that realization is something no debate can ever erase. As the echoes of the discussion slowly faded, one thing became abundantly clear. This had not been just another academic discussion. It wasn't something that would be forgotten in a news cycle. It wouldn't be buried under the endless noise of social media. It was a reminder that no matter how divided people may seem, no matter how loudly the world proclaims that faith is obsolete, there are still people searching for meaning. There are still people searching for something beyond the tangible. That night, Dr. Qadhi did not try to change minds. He simply told a story. But sometimes a story is enough. And if this story made you think, if it stirred something inside you, don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep searching. Keep listening. Because sometimes the answers we seek don't come from winning a debate. They come from conversations we never expected to have. Faith isn't just about answers. It's about the questions we dare to ask. Tonight's discussion wasn't about winning a debate. It was about starting a conversation, one that many are afraid to have. If this story made you think, if it stirred something inside you, don't let it end here. Keep searching, keep questioning, and keep listening. And if you want to be part of more thought-provoking discussions like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore, and I'd love for you to be on this journey with us. See you in the next video.